Marvel Rivals is probably the most boring version of a support in a video game I've ever seen. Many of the strategists have a heal-bot playstyle as the most effective way to play, with a few obvious exceptions, but even these exceptions are being shoehorned into an unfun, boring heal-bot playstyle. But before I get ahead of myself, the only way to compensate for the absurd amount of damage in this game is to have an equally ridiculous amount of sustain. This takes form in many supports. Your primary fire leaves you with the decision to either heal your team or do a minor amount of damage, building you less ult charge. And any support that can do both is usually pretty awful at healing through heavy sustained damage and unviable outside of triple support. Supports like Luna, Invis, Loki, and Cloak all have the option to either use their primary fire to essentially make anyone they're paying attention to effectively immortal, or do a moderate amount of damage that gives them a tiny amount of ult charge in comparison to just shooting their tank. Rocky and Jeff are at least a little bit different, as they have to press a different button when switching between the two, but this is the root of my problem with supports. Because their ults are so strong and have the ability to shut down nearly every ult in the game, any playstyle that doesn't lead to building that ult as fast as possible is borderline trolling. I'm going to go over ultimate rotations later in the video, but this right here is my main problem with supports. The cooldowns, the self-peel, the mobility, the passives, the damage, none of it matters if they don't have an ultimate that can turn their team immortal for the entire fight. Let's take a look at Rocket Raccoon, arguably one of the worst designed characters in this game, where 2/3 of his kit budget went into a set and forget revive beacon that effectively leaves your team at a +1 in terms of bodies on the map. And to balance it out, it's an egregious 45-second long cooldown that can be destroyed remotely if you suspect it's about to be destroyed, leaving it on a fraction of the cooldown. If the only way to balance your ability is to place it on an absurdly long cooldown, then make it an ultimate. This goes for a Strange Portal especially. League of Legends does this well with Zillion ult, where it creates a window for a few seconds that is very visible to both teams that when targeted the hero dies, it revives you in the same place after a few seconds with a percentage of your HP. If you design abilities with long cooldowns, you can only create a scenario where you wait until the perfect moment to use said cooldown. You cannot by any means use Loki Lamp or Atom Soul Bond proactively without leaving a long window of vulnerability open, and that right there is my main issue with long cooldowns. They do not permit the existence of utilizing the cooldown in a proactive way, creating an experience where if both teams have the same plan, you may be able to count how many times you've used it on one hand. Rocket Raccoon Beacon is one of the worst designed abilities in a hero shooter I've ever seen. It's boring for the Raccoon player as you essentially just place it where it won't be seen, and it shoots out armor packs that essentially have zero impact on the game, and a jump pack that only breaks the flow of combat. Getting kidnapped by a Wolverine with a jump pack is a zero interaction tank assassination. But if the only way to play against something is to play a specific counter, you have a terrible game that doesn't allow enough variety to create engaging interactions on a game-to-game basis. Tangent over, let's get back on track. Rocket Raccoon Beacon aside, he had one of the only utility ults in the game, as most ultimates in Rivals boil down to a big circle on the ground that kills everything or a big circle on the ground that heals everything. Having a utility ultimate that actually takes deliberate thought was unique and took effort to use, as when comboed with other ultimates, it created windows to break through support ultimates. However, they completely flipped the whole thing on its head and was shoehorned into being another brain-dead reactionary ultimate that you only use when hearing an enemy ultimate voice line. Jeff the Land Shark is the ultimate form of fanbait in this game by far, and it's not even close. He had one of the more unique kits in the support role. He had only 2 buttons, a primary and a secondary fire. This is rare for Rivals as they love their characters having a million buttons, but regardless, he had a unique playstyle that didn't fit the typical mold of a normal support gameplay loop. So they gutted, dry-aged, and sous vide him into a completely different hero. I mean, it was completely unhealthy for the game, but besides that, it generally made the game a bit more enjoyable, as outlandish strategies were not only fun, but actually were really strong in the right hands. I overall support the change they made, however it leaves a clear indicator of where the devs' heads are at. They want supports to be passive until ultimates come up, and other than a few creators shilling the change, it had an overall negative feedback that most Jeff players did not like. They reworked Jeff to be like every other support in the category, making another forgettable piece of garbage only played for his team up. This is a clear indicator to me that NetEase wants his gameplay for strategists to some degree. babysit your entire team until your ultimate comes up, and this is what supports in Rivals boil down to. And this is why it feels so difficult to have an impact as a support in this game in the neutral. The most skill expression from support stems from playing against dive. The laid back and heal bot playstyle is most effective when the team is working with one angle and not distracted by enemies taking different angles. The moment your team is pressured by more than one angle, you are left with the heavy decision making that can lead to a win or a loss very quickly. This leads to many players who pick up support for their laid back front to back heal bot playstyle to feel pretty awful when a team wants nothing more than to take supports out of the game, or divert their attention to directly help their team steamroll. But even this expression of skill falls flat in a game like Marvel Rivals when introducing a third strategist. Triple support has to be the most unapologetically unhealthy comp in the game, and it's not even close. Game designers often weed out degenerate or unhealthy game mechanics that deviate from the core design philosophies early on. Triple support has had multiple iterations but has been relatively similar. One heal bot, one damage by support, and one flex. This comp leads to long, boring, drawn out games that are really only decided by the trades of ultimates. If you stack support ultimates, you lose. If your support presses Q due to panic, you lose. And if you just don't have enough overpowered ultimates, you just lose. Triple support has to be the most degenerate comp that is encouraged by the developers and NetEase through each and every patch. This is not only a byproduct of their heavy bias towards open queue, but is a direct indicator of the direction NetEase wants to take this game. I believe triple support has to be the epitome of the Marvel Rivals gameplay loop. Long, boring, drawn out poke brawls that leave everyone drooling at their keyboard until someone presses Q. But let's put a pin in that for now. The decision to give triple support a slight slap in the wrist in terms of balance versus the heavy-handed reaction the developers give to dive gives me and the player base a clear indicator of where they want the game to be in terms of gameplay loop and general experience. This, coupled with the passive nature of tanks in the game, creates an unbelievably horrible experience for the veteran player that trickles down to the casual audience that has to put up with it in even quick play. As a former Vanguard player myself, I came to multiple conclusions about the tanking role in a game loosely held together by its IP. There's plenty of anti-tank abilities in Marvel Rivals that are highly problematic that create a miserable experience for the average tank player. Groot cuts you off from your entire team, and how have we not learned from our competitor that tank hate on a tank is the most insufferable garbage to go against? Anyway, Wolverine has cross-map kidnapping capabilities that require you to constantly be aware of his position and rely on the utility of your team. Bucky is a bit of the same, but is a bit more telegraphed, but easily just as unhealthy as Wolverine's. Emma Frost with their grab and many more. Regardless, this creates a miserable experience for the tank, and forces you to essentially play extremely far back or safe, discouraging you from absorbing any pressure for your team for too long. Tanks and Rivals are useful when getting pumped with heals and are on a timer when they're not getting looked at. Because they have no real way of knowing when we'll stop getting heals, it creates playing tank painfully boring in many common scenarios. Solo tanking is a miserable experience as you are essentially a non-factor in trying not to die. Playing a non-shield tank into poke is borderline unplayable, and damage is far too high for the majority of damage mitigation to be proactive. The only enjoyable part of tank is really being able to swing a fight with Magneto ult and killing the support with their ultimate. Emma Frost's playstyle at the surface seems to be able to grab people and kick them into your team, but doing so leaves you in the most vulnerable state afterwards with your most important ability on a long ass cooldown. This leaves you essentially defenseless with no mobility in the enemy team's frontline. And this is only amplified in the Emma Frost mirror. On the launch of Season 2, it was an Emma mirror pretty much every game, and generally the first Emma to use Diamond form would lose. This would make it so both Emmas essentially stared at each other until one of them got bored and used a long cooldown to then get punished as soon as it ended. Can you see how this is bad? This same goes for Magneto, Penny, Thing, Hulk, and to a degree Strange. Strange has his Maelstrom of Madness, but can be built over time after fighting for a few seconds. The issue with only having reactionary defense-based cooldowns is purely because it makes tanks boring, and victim to the proactive plays of their own team. Tanks only really have short windows to walk up, and when they do, they are left in a very vulnerable state right afterwards. It's why a lot of tanks in Rivals are punished for making proactive plays, and why tanks are so unappealing to the general player base that likes this genre. Tanking in Rivals isn't as interesting as other roles, and is completely reliant to the attention span of your supports. I find the only interesting tanks to be the ones who don't fall under that category, Captain America and Venom, to be specific. Being enabled and having the ability to essentially throw yourself into the entire team doesn't really exist in Marvel Rivals. There's far too much damage and reliance on sustain to play anything but main, and the only tanks capable of challenging angles are constantly nerfed to unviable states or easily countered. I believe NetEase wants tanking to be only fighting down main, taking damage, and feeding support ults. This is clear by their design choices regarding poke meta and the constant nerfing of tanks capable of challenging off angles. I've always despised the notion that tanks are inherently boring and that tanks are incapable of being engaging. This line of thinking is so accepted and embraced by a large part of the community, and sees tank as this job that people need to fill in for time to time. Why does the tank role have to feel that way? Why can't it just be as engaging as the DPS category? I believe the answer mostly boils down to variety, but that's a whole other conversation. Now, it would be disingenuous for me to say I didn't enjoy tanking for quite a long time, but if you make tanks boring for a large percentage of the game, you can't expect too many players to get excited about it.